Welcome to Eternal Journey, the podcast.
What is up, everyone, and welcome back for another episode of Eternal Journey. I am your host, Jedi, and this is going to be episode number 6, where we are going to be discussing the power curve of a limited deck today. It's an important fundamental skill for both drafting and sealed, so I am looking forward to discussing it with you guys. But first things first, I want to mention our Patreon, patreon.com/EJ the podcast. If you're getting something out of this show one way or another and decide, hey, you know what, I want to throw a little bit of a contribution back at it, by all means, you can get on there. You can pledge as little as $1 a show. You get a little bit of extra content and things like that. So a small contribution is greatly appreciated. So thank you very much. Next, we're going to do our pack 1 pick 1, where we are going to be opening a pack of the most recent set, which in this case is Defiance, and set 5 for Eternal. And we're going to be discussing what our picks are and pick orders as if we were in the first pack of a draft. Going right into our comments, we're going to have Unmoored Valkyrie, which is a 1/1 Valkyrie for 1 green. It has flying and then renown, i.e. if you target it with a weapon or a spell, it gains lifesteal. I think the card's a little bit better than it seems. Typically 1/1 is even flyer for ones. Even flyers don't impact the board enough, but the fact that it is in a renowned color with plenty of equipment gives it a little bit of credit, but at the same time, I'm not high on it. Next, we have Token of Vision, which is a depleted power that covers time, justice, and shadow. These are fine to pick up, but I definitely want to be taking it first pick. We then have a Bannerman, which is a 2/2 soldier for 2. No influence requirements, and when you summon, you get an influence of your choice. So this is really good fixing. It goes in every deck. It would be something that we would pick, I guess, for right now until we get to the rest of the pack, just because it keeps us the most open. Next up, we have Endure, which is a 0 cost 1 and green influence spell. Give one of your units invulnerable to damage this turn. So I think this card is just straight up horrible. I mean, it is a renowned trigger, and that's it, because it is not a fast spell, so you can't use it to negate a combat trick or something like that. So, you know, and then your opponent see it coming. So yeah, you can get in one attack with something big, but I'm not impressed by it. So still on Bannerman. Next up, we have Consuming Greed. This card was modified for limited play, and it is a 2/1 Nightmare for 4 and a shadow. It has flying, and when you summon it, you may sacrifice a relic to play a 6/4 Rust Fiend. So I've seen this card play. I think a 2/1 flyer for 4 just isn't enough. It doesn't really make the cut. I'm very hesitant to put this in this deck, but the ability to change one of your unusable or already used up relics into a 6/4 is not bad. You know, obviously you have to go off of the cost of the relic that you're using, but Shadow does have a lot of enter the battlefield gain ability relics that sometimes do something after, sometimes not. So there is a little bit of synergy there, but I'm not very high on it because I like to evaluate a card for what it is, standalone worst case scenario typically, and that's just not it. Next up, we have Master Cartographer. It is a 2/1 Elf Explorer for 2 and a blue. It has a summon loot, i.e. draw a card and then discard a card. And I like this card. I think it will help you get to your power drops if you are lacking them. It is good in the early game. It is good in the late game because then you could ship away those extra powers or sigils and to look for gas. So I think it's good. I think for the sake of staying open, I'd probably still stay with Bannerman. Next up, we have Infused Guardian, and I absolutely love this card. I think it's great. It is a 4/4 Sentinel for 5 at a time. It has Endurance and Pledge, which gives you some cushioning on having multiples in your deck because you can always pledge it away to become a Time Sigil in your opening hand. And then it has Empower +1/+1. So it permanently grows every time you play a Sigil. In a color that typically wants to ramp once or twice. You have Find a Way. I like this card. I actually tend to play it more on turn 6 than I do 5, just because there's a lot of things in the format that deal 4 damage at the common uncommon level. So I prefer to make sure I can play it and then immediately play a Sigil to get it up to 5/5, where it's a lot harder to deal with. And this card it scales well. It ends the game. It makes it to where all the sigils you draw are relevant. So yeah, I think this one might actually, even though it being a little bit higher, it is a color I do enjoy playing. So I'd probably switch to Infused Guardian here for my first pick. Next up, we have Surveiller, which is a 5/2 Sentinel, 4 and a fire, and it has Pledge, and that's it. I'm not excited about it. I think it's okay filler at best, but really not thrilled about it. And so yeah, I'm still on Guardian. All right, moving on to the uncommons. Next up, we have New Order Watchwing. It's a 4/4 Valkyrie for 6 Justice, and it has flying, and then it has Renown. Play a relic weapon with attack and defense equal to the cost of that spell or weapon. So I think this card's great. A 4/4 flyer for 6 is pretty good, honestly. It is not bad. It's a big beefy creature in the air, but the Renown trigger really like kind of incentivizes you to protect it or to equip it to get a little bit bigger. Slapping the mace on this, so it is a 6/6 flyer with lifesteal, and then you get a 6/6 relic weapon, is just a beating. It's typically a 3-for-1. It's really hard for your opponent to come back from that. So just something to think about. I do like this card. That even though it being a 6-drop and it's double justice, it might be enough to take over the Infused Guardian. I guess there's, it's a little harder to splash with double justice, but it is a 6-drop, so you have time to get there. It might be the Watchwing. Next up in the uncommons, we have Rallying Banner, which is a 5 and a justice relic. Once per turn, you may pay 2 to give one of your units +1/+1 this turn for each of your units. So Rallying Banner is great. You have 3 or 4 units on the board. All of a sudden, you're giving something a +3/+3 or +4/+4 every turn. Heaven forbid it should have evasion. It really helps break stalemates, and it really helps you win the game. That being said, it does absolutely nothing when you are behind. And it does take up that very valuable 5 slot. So I think later on in the draft, I would be more inclined to take it when I had a better idea of what my deck was looking like. But this early as pack 1, pick 1, I would not take it. So I'm sticking with the Watchwing. And our last uncommon, and this is a doozy, is Cliff Diver Mantisaur. It is a 4/3 dinosaur, 5 blue, and it has flying, Aegis, and Pledge. Boom. So I think this card is fantastic because 95% of the time it is going to be a 2-for-1. It is in a color that cares about Renown. The fact that it has Aegis makes it to where your opponent has to spend 2 spells on it potentially to kill it unless they have a combat trick and a decent flyer. It also makes it to where you feel a little bit better about trying to slap an equipment on it. And it has the insurance of having Pledge. So if you get it in your opening hand and you really don't want to drop a card, you can totally use it as a sigil. So I think it being a little bit cheaper and a little bit better against removal would lead me towards taking the Mantisaur first. And then finally, our rare is Storm Tamer Operative. It is a 2/3 unseen for 2 and a blue. And all spells deal -1 damage. Yeah, this card's not very impressive. I guess if you're in a deck that doesn't really care about damage spells on your end, like you don't have any, they're just combat tricks, then having a 2/3 for 2 is fine. But other than that, it's definitely not beating out Watchwing or Mantisaur or even Guardian. So yeah, Cliff Diver Mantisaur is the pick. All right, well, that was the pack one, pick one for this episode. Hope you guys got a little of it. I'm starting to establish my own opinions of cards and whatnot based off of what I'm seeing as I'm drafting more and playing in the monthly sealed event. So I will keep passing that information along to you all, and hopefully I'll up your game a little bit. All right, so let's go into our topic, power curve. So first, let me discuss what or why having a solid curve in your deck is so important. And then I'll go into breaking it down to actually what it is. So essentially, you want to spread out the casting cost of all your spells and units evenly or pseudo evenly on a curve. That's why they call it a curve, a power curve, up the scale. That way you have the highest chance of playing a card every turn, and then eventually getting to the point where you could play 2 cards a turn, because that's when you start pulling ahead from your opponent. You really unlimited. The turns are so, I mean, everything is limited. Like one misplay on combat can essentially swing the game to whether you know you're going to win or lose. Or if opponent has a great start and you just take too long to get on the board, they can crush you. So building a deck with a good power curve in mind allows it to where you can play something every step of the way. And believe me, that goes a long way towards essentially minimizing you giving away free wins. I'm sure everyone that's played a little bit limited has experienced that, where you keep a hand that you are on the play and you have a 3-drop or maybe just a 4-drop, and it just turns out your opponent goes 1-drop, 2-drop, 3-drop, 4-drop. So by the time you play your 3 or 4-drop and they already have a space to have the removal spell for it, and they keep bashing, you're already too low at life and you're essentially on the back foot for the rest of the game, unless you have some really great cards to kind of 2-for-1 you, get you back into it. So that's why having a curve is so important. And the flip side is relevant as well. A lot of times it can make up for not having strength in card quality. If you didn't get a bomb rare or strong uncommons and you're playing with mainly just a bunch of commons and a few uncommons that kind of put your deck together, if you're able to kind of play out your game every single time, you have the potential of taking advantage of your opponent whenever they stumble, if they miss a power drop or a power play, or if they end up leaving a part of their curve open. Let's say they don't do anything on turn 3 and 4 and you're still making plays, you can essentially just steal games from them because you are beating them to the punch, so to speak, and then they have to kind of react to what you're doing, and that puts you in the driver's seat. So yeah, those are pretty much the reasons why you kind of want to make sure that you're taking the time to not just kind of pick the cards you think are the coolest or whatnot, or that you really want to play, but that granted, there's nothing wrong with that. You just want to keep in mind consideration for your curve. For example, let's say you want to play this awesome rare bomb that's like a 6-drop, and then you pick up like 2 removal spells that are like 6 and 7, and then you see another big guy that you want to take just in case because you really like playing with that card. So all of a sudden now you look and you have 6, 7, 8 cards that are upwards of 5 power. Well, having that many increases your chances of drawing them early. So then you'll just have a dead card in your hand for way too long, and then it messes up your curve. Let's say you keep a hand and you have a 2, no 3, no 4, and then a 5. Well, when you're waiting to draw that 3 and 4 to kind of connect your curve, you could potentially draw another one of those 6 and 7s, which essentially did you nothing. So you have to take another turn off. So it's little things like that that can kind of really decide a game of limited, which also gives you the potential to either win free games or lose free games, or give out free losses. So that's why we're going to be talking about that today. And we're going to go ahead and break it down by both the card types that you want to have in your deck, and then we will break it down by how many or the ratios of each of those card types you'd like to have in your deck. So let's see. First up, we're going to have units. Units are the basic way that limited games are decided because they are the most common in this game. And most trading card games, units are what you have the most of. So that's going to be the majority of what makes up your curve, and mainly because of the fact that, like, if in a perfect world, in a vacuum, if you're getting the cards that you want on the turn, you're really not going to be playing too many units off of curve, i.e. like playing a 2-drop on turn 7 on purpose. There are some that take advantage of that. Let's say if a unit destroys an equipment or an attachment, then you might want to hold that off till later, etc. But in most cases, you're going to want to play your 2s on 2, 3s on 3, 4 on 4s. So that's why playing with your units and kind of adjusting your curve off of that is the most important one. And you're going to average somewhere between 15 to 20 units. It's a little bit of a high variance, but it depends mainly on whether you're going with an aggressive deck, you're going with a mid-range deck, or you're going with a more controlling deck. Will kind of dictate more or less the amount of creatures or units you're going to be playing. But you want to stick somewhere between 15 to 20. All right, next up you have your spells and relics. Okay, and I chalk these up to the same category because of the fact that, like, they essentially do similar things, where especially relic weapons, they're used as removal spells, they're used as armor gain, and then spells, obviously, whether they're combat tricks or removal spells, still kind of affect the game, put units into play, etc., etc. And then you have like the support relics or the utility relics, things that like might give your units flying, things that might stun your opponent and whatnot. So all those kind of get chalked up in this category, and you're typically, even in a control deck, not going to have as many as you would units, just because it's a lot more difficult to do something like that in limited. And so you're going to be looking at somewhere between 7 to 10 spells and relics in this category. Once again, it could fluctuate. You can have more in a control deck where you have more removal spells or tricks and things like that, maybe some card draw, but typically that's about the range you're going to be doing. And lastly, we have power, what essentially your resource to play the game, and that's going to be somewhere between 17 to 19. I haven't really come across decks where I went down to 16, and I think 20 might up your chances of flooding a little too much. If you have some card filtering, things like looting, like the cartographer that we spoke about earlier, that could potentially help you to be okay running more power than that. But 17 to 19 is typically about where I float at. Yeah, and it seems to work out for me. I kind of base it off of how much I have in the top end, i.e., how many units and spells and things I have in the 5 and 6 slot. With Defiance, there is Amplify, so Amplify kind of plays around with that a little bit. Am I good with my Amplifies being at 5, 6, and 7, or do I have some of the bigger ones that require 8, 9, and 10 power? And then that kind of gauges how high I go, as far as if I go past 18 for that 19th. And then if I go down to 17, it's normally when my deck is more low to the ground, a lot of cheap creatures and cheap power combat tricks and removal to kind of just burn my opponent out as quickly as possible. Then I really want to be drawing more gas, i.e. more cards that affect the board, than power at a certain point, because typically those decks probably curve out or curve top at about 4, maybe 5 with 1 or 2 cards. So yeah, once again, a quick recap. You're going to want 15 to 20 units, 7 to 10 spells / relics, and then 17 to 19 power in your decks. All right, so now let's go ahead and break down the curve. This means, especially talking about specifically each kind of part of the curve. Most spells typically will go somewhere on the curve, especially removal. When you're building your decks, fortunately, doing it online gives you the chance to kind of keep reviewing your cards and see what your deck's looking like as you're piecing it together. So it's really important as you're doing this to try to start placing things in the categories that they belong. Once again, as I stated earlier, the units are pretty simple, just because of the fact you want to play your 2 drops on your second turn, you want to play your 3 drops on your 3, and typically your 5s and 6s, you definitely want to hit them as soon as possible. So the units typically go what their cost is. That's pretty standard. Where it starts to get a little hokey is things like relics and removal spells and things like that. For example, let's take the Quicksilver Amulet that potentially freezes. Let me just double check real quick. I want to make sure I'm getting the correct one here. It could be named incorrectly, so I want to make sure I get it right for you guys. So give me 1 second. I want to make sure I'm getting you guys the correct name. Thanks for bearing with me on that real quick. Set the filters and Frost Talisman. There we go. I knew I wasn't correct. Okay, so for example, the Frost Talisman. It is a 2-cost relic, but chances are you aren't going to be playing it on turn 2 because of the fact that when it comes into play, I summon, you stun an enemy unit. So playing this on 2, if you're on the play, okay, you get to stun their 2-drop, and if you're on the draw, and if you're on the play, then you're gonna stun their 1-drop, and then the second ability is pay 7 to draw a card, which you're obviously not gonna use anytime soon. So even though it is a 2-cost spell or relic, you really want to place that higher up on your curve, more accurate to where you think you're gonna typically be playing it. This goes for removal spells as well. Just because you have Conflagrate, right? It is a 2-cost burn spell. It doesn't mean you're going to potentially use it on turn 2. Sometimes you will if your opponent has a really aggressive start and your hand is slow. But sometimes you also might play with its amplify cost. So now if you're going to play it for 7, you want to move it and keep it categorized kind of that way on your curve. And that way you know, okay, this is what it's looking, because it can be really easy to take maybe 3 6-drops and be like, oh, I'm good, I don't have anything else. But then when you look at your spells, you have a ton of 5, and then like Cut Ties, which is a phenomenal premium removal spell, is at 6. So all of a sudden, when you thought you might only have 4 cards at +5, you end up having 8, which could end up really damaging your curve. So it's really important to kind of place things where you expect yourself to be playing them. Equipment like weapons is a little bit easier to do because typically you're probably going to be playing them not too far off from their curve, essentially, unless you have something better to play. But I think it's fairly accurate as well, except the cheaper ones. Obviously, like, once again, going back to 1s and 2s, you're not going to really play those too early in the game because you're going to be upgrading your 2/2 to a 3/3. That really doesn't do much, especially with like no target and stuff like that. So yeah, all right, so let's go ahead and start breaking it down. So we have first up your 2-drops, and I go ahead and include 1-drops in this. Reason being is you typically do not want to play a 1-cost spell in your deck. Some removal spells qualify, and then in some corner cases, very efficient. They synergize with your deck 1-drops, or for example, like I really like the Scorpions and the Spiders because they are a 1/1 for 1, but they have deadly, which means 9 out of 10 times they're going to be trading up, and I treat them as a pseudo removal spell or combat trick. So yeah, I think they are great. So things like that are excusable 1-drops. That being said, I still just throw them into the same category as 2-drops because really they don't impact the board enough late game, so you don't want too many of them, but they are so important to get out early, because if not, we have the potential of getting ran over like we talked about earlier in the show. So you want to have somewhere between 5 to 7 2-drops. I err a little more towards 6 and 7. Reason being is that it's really a good way to slow down the game. Even if they're there to prevent your opponent from attacking just one time or to chump block something, it really helps go the distance instead of just kind of giving your opponent the open door. The solid average rate for this is obviously a 2/2 for 2. Anything in that category, i.e. like the baseline strangers, are good fillers. Sometimes you get better things like that than like the cartographer, which is great because it's pretty good early. 2/1 is fine. You prefer a 2/2. There's plenty of things in this format that can kill 1 toughness unit, but the fact that it lets you loot early and later on in the game gives it some versatility, which increases its usefulness. Locust is another great 2-drop because it is 2/2 for 2, but then also has flying. So if your opponent is not doing much, you can start getting in there in the air, which is always a great thing. So yeah. Moving right along, we have our next sliders are 3 drops, which may include some removal, and it is up to you on whether you want to, what removal you really want to place in this. Like for example, I mentioned, let's go with Torch. Torch is great at all points of the game, but there is a good chance, A, because it only costs 1, and 2, because it's 3 damage, that there's a high chance that you actually play it early to slow down your opponent's attack or aggression, and kind of use it while you can. So there are some removal spells that go in here, and you could potentially count that towards your curve count. But once again, I use that at your discretion. Combat tricks I typically don't slot here. Reason being is that if you are taking your turn 3 off to do a combat trick to once again remove, keep your 2-drop alive, or take out your opponent's 2-drop, I don't feel like it's a very favorable trade, especially at such a limited amount of resources. Granted, there are corner cases if you have like the rare fanatic that you want to drop as early as you can and you want to keep it alive, and that's understandable. But yeah, only a handful of removal goes here. Typically you're still in the unit range, maybe a couple of relics if they kind of help things in the future. And once again, this is back to 5 to 7 cards, and the reason being is that you are always going to be in these parts of the game. You're always going to have your turn 2, you're always going to have your turn 3, and the momentum of the game is decided in these turns. So it's really important that you have at least one play to make in these. And you'll find out really quickly how that can make a difference whenever you play a game where you're short. You're forced, you go down to 6 and your first spell is at 4 and you're just dreading life right now. And so you realize how valuable it is to have those 2 and 3 drops. So that's why the number for these are so high. And plus 3, you actually start to get some utility out of your units. You start to get 3 3s for 3 with some upside and things like that, or merchants are at the 3 slot. So it's not a horrible place to be in where you're kind of miserable that you have all these vanilla IE units with, and by vanilla I mean units with no rules text, just straight stats on them. That's not very often the case, especially with Eternal. Next on the line, we have our 4 drops. This is when you really can start getting a little pickier about what cards you're taking in the draft or using in the sealed, because there's a lot of 4 drops, and you're only going to want somewhere between 3 to 5 of these, because it is the bridge of the development stage to the late game. Your 4 drops are going to want to start tipping the scales in one side or another. You start to get more value out of your cards. The units are bigger stat wise. You get more interesting abilities on these cards and things like that. But so it's very easy to kind of get carried away and start showing up with 6, 7 4 drops, which isn't horrible in the right kind of deck. But you typically want to still limit yourself somewhere between 3 to 5. I am probably one of those people that errs on 4 being a little more forgiving, and so I'm like closer to 5, 6 every time. But once again, I do like the fact that some of them have pledge, so if you do get more than one, you can kind of get rid of one early and you have enough time to draw another one later. So definitely take that into consideration. 4 is also about the place where you might start to see some of your combat tricks and things like that. If your opponent has a flyer, you need to take it out, or just kind of use some of your more limited removal while you can. Like for example, if you have a suffocate, that's not going to be as good late game, so you want to use it now while it still has some effect on the board. Moving right up the chain, we have our 5 drops, and this is when your deck really starts to get slim. You really want a limited amount of slots for these, and so you want to get very picky. I always recommend trying to take these later in the draft unless you just see a bomb or a super efficient one. Reason being the simple fact that there's an equal amount of them, but less slots. So the 3 drop slot, you're looking to fill up 7 slots versus the 5 drop, you're talking about now 5 or 4 slots. So 2 or 3 less than earlier, but there's the same amount of saturation in every pack. So you could be a little more picky about taking these, and I would take them late, because the worst thing that can happen is you take a mediocre 5 drop early because you think it's decent, and then later on you fill out the rest of your curve, and then later on in the pack you see a really good 5 drop that you kind of either have to pass because you need more 2 or 3 drops, or you end up taking it and then that you wasted a pick earlier in the draft. So 5 drops are there. Like I said, you typically want to really take units that really affect the board. They have some kind of evasion, they're huge, they have special effects, or really solid premium removal spells, relics, things like that. And lastly, we have our 6+ drops, and here we're really looking at 1 or 2 cards only. Occasionally, like I said, because of things like cut ties and that lifesteal mace, you might bump up to 3 or 4, but in very rare cases, I would definitely recommend upping your sigil count there. And these cards are just premium removal, super efficient bombs. For example, the 5/6 Sentinel in Defiance, that every time 5/6 for 6 is just fine stats, and then the fact that you can attack it plays another sigil, so it ramps you, cleans up your draws, etc., help feeds your amplifies. Cards like that are good, but even then, if you pick every single one you see in a draft, so you finish your draft with 6 of these, you're not going to play all 6. Your deck is going to be too slow. So one of the reasons why we limit our 6+ cards to 2, and once again, you really want to wait as long as possible to pick them up in the draft, unless you just see something that is not going to wheel, like a cut ties or just a bomb card like Zoe or something like that. You just take those because you're not going to wheel them. But yeah, so the purpose of this is you want to be able to lay out your cards and see that it makes a nice, cool kind of curve, starting from your 2 drops being your highest at 6-7 cards, kind of taper plateaus a little bit into your 3s, and then it slowly curves down as you go up the curve to your 6-7 drops, because chances are, like, after about turn 4, you're really not going to be hitting your power drops every single turn. The difference between, you've heard a lot of people say the difference between your 6th and 7th power is huge, because chances are you may hit your 6th power turn 7, turn 8, but to hit your 7th power, now you're talking about turn 10 maybe. So sometimes you might not get there. So having 2 or 3 cards that cost that much, that don't just straight up win you the game, can just be rotting in your hand. And then obviously drawing them on like turn 2, you're just utterly miserable, because it's going to be 6-7 turns before you even get remotely close to playing that card. So yeah, that is kind of where we are with building a curve, or a power curve. I keep wanting to say mana curve because the MTG, but power curve for Eternal. I hope you guys took a little bit something from this podcast and learned it. It is a very fundamental skill, but it is one that really helps out both in limited draft and constructed, because especially in a slower format like sealed, which I found out, and it might be a little different with Defiance, but it actually isn't that slow of a format. That might have been just a habit that crossed over from Magic. So yeah, hope you guys enjoyed it. Follow me on social media. You can follow me on Twitter, Patreon, and YouTube at EJ the Podcast. I post draft videos and sealed tournaments and constructed tournaments on YouTube channel. Just finished posting a video of me opening up 65 packs, 30 from the Twitch Influence store, as well as 35 from the recent ECQ tournament that I was in. And then also follow me on Twitch/Jedi_EJ, where I stream drafts, I stream my sealed play, ranked climb, and come chat, hang out with me, see the content, and ask me your questions. I'll be happy to answer them live on the air. If you have any feedback or questions or anything like that for me, you can send it to ejthepodcast@gmail.com. I look forward to hearing from you. And once again, a quick shout out to Marshall Sutcliffe and LSV from Limited Resources, which is the MTG counterpart to this podcast. I've kind of gauged or started to guide this podcast based off of what they do. So yeah, give them a shout if you do play MTG. They're great. And once again, thank you guys so much for listening. I look forward to seeing you on Twitch. Until next time.